G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Australian Property Investment Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Christie David. I run a mortgage broking business called Atelier Wealth, where we specialise in helping property investors build a scalable and quality investment property portfolio with the end goals, one of them being to build intergenerational wealth through investing in property. So as investors go on the journey, there are people that come along for the ride with them, maybe see them in the right direction, maybe have eyes on their blind spots as well. And one of the big partners, I'd say, in the journey is a quality buyer's agent. And today's name and guest that we've got in the studio today is a name that's synonymous in the buyer's agency space, really setting the standard in this space as well, and also contributing to the industry through great publications, in thought-leading articles as well, and a name that also features heavily in the media. Welcome to the studio, Cate Bakos.
It is an absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
Thank you for being here. And I'm going to say that the work that you've put out there, it comes from a great place. I feel like you have sit on a mountain of knowledge. You share that. It's not to toot your own horn, but it's just to say you are genuinely trying to help home buyers and investors make great decisions. And that's where I feel like there's a real strong alignment here as well.
Oh, it's a delight. I love writing. I love contributing, and you're absolutely right. Just, sharing the knowledge and equipping people who can't afford or go for the services of a buyer's agent. It's nice to give back.
Perfect. Having a look at your journey, they always say you can connect the dots looking backwards, and I feel that's something that's really telling in your journey. Kind of when you've left uni, I understand you probably had a career in marketing, then you've gone through and you've had a great career in mortgage broking, which is probably where we will connect as well. And then now moving into the buyer's agency space. And I think the time that you were broking it was a real critical time to be in the industry. We're talking around the GFC, for example. So we talk about moving goalposts, we talk about consumer sentiment, for example, and working through a lot of businesses are built off the back of when their back's against the wall and when things get a little bit tougher. So reflecting on your journey, Cate, and sharing with us a little bit about your own journey to get to this stage. Love to hear a little bit more on what we call the 3 Ps about yourself personally, professionally, and then your own property journey as well.
Absolutely. I'm happy for any and all of your questions, but you really touched on something that I think shaped the way that I work as an advocate now. And that is just how important and how connected finance is to being able to roll out an investment strategy, and how much things have changed. Obviously, when I first started investing, we had low doc, no doc loans. When I was a mortgage broker before the GFC, I was able to write 104% LVR loans for some buyers. And, we look at that now with all of the compliance and restrictions and credit fears and all of the lessons we've learned and marvel about how things have changed. But we had our own sets of challenges back when I started investing as well, right down to LMI not always being an option for you. And we had to have much higher funding contribution when we were putting together a deposit. Things have changed, and we've had easier changes and harder changes. Yeah,
well said. And everyone says, "Oh, look, buying a property, 5-10 years ago was much easier." I look. There are some parts to it where I'm like, definitely it could have and it was easier, but we can't live in the past. I'm like, those sets of guidelines, that type of buying strategy maybe worked then. The market has changed. The way that banks are lending has changed. Like you're saying, some for the better and some were a bit loose in terms of credit policy, and I think they had to have changed as well. And you're right, mortgage insurance has been one of those that have maybe adapted a little bit and changed. And the next part is, I guess, something like rental income shading was never a thing up until quite a few years ago, for example, where they treated interest-only periods compared to what they do now. So if this is new terminology to you, feel free to reach out so we can give you some context there. But for the more seasoned investor, they will know that their borrowing capacity can sometimes take a hit as their portfolio goes up and increases. And that's why yield becomes somewhat more important as well for some investors, right?
Yeah, well said. Yeah. Really well said. I used to sit there with lender calculators, and as we both know, the borrowing capacity calculations are very different across different lenders because they have different attitudes towards all aspects of a loan application, from the type of job that you're doing to your residency status to how long you've been in your job. And there are so many twists and turns. So you've really got to get it right and know who you're targeting. And I modelled out my acquisition strategy based on basically what I could do, what money I could get my hands on, and what yields I had to have, and where the properties could be. There was a fair amount of science. It wasn't all art.
Yeah, very nice. And look, some buyers agents come from different backgrounds. So say, for example, they've built their own portfolio themselves. So they'll use their own knowledge acquired on their journey. Some come from a real estate background. Some like yourselves come from a mortgage broking background, for example. So you will bring a very unique perspective when you're talking to your clients, going, okay, look, you're buying this. Maybe you're going to reach borrowing, you're going to max out your borrowing capacity, or you're looking to buy 2 or 3. Maybe we're talking about splitting deposits, for example, and that type of insight isn't something that comes very easily for some buyers agents compared to yourself as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it was a very valuable apprenticeship. When I look back at it now, all of the headaches I had dealing with lenders and the things that I didn't love about being a mortgage broker, I'm so grateful that I learnt them and mastered them.
Yeah, nice one. And then being a buyer's agent, and you started your own Cate Bakos brand since 2014. So look, I'm going to say I won't say a new proposition, but buyer's agency was probably in its infancy at that stage as well. So you probably had to grow a little bit of that knowledge around what you do and why you do it, compared to the do-it-yourself type model as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I started the concept in 2010 and joined a large firm it wasn't so large at the time, in 2011, and then went out on my own in 2014. And particularly, in those early years, there were some buyer's agents out there, and there was a lot of information, a lot of printed media. You could really get a feel for what buyer's agents did, and particularly the investment strategist buyer's agents. And that was really what I set my heart on. I wanted to continue talking to investors and helping people get their head around the concept of investing for those who wanted to create wealth and hadn't gone down that path before. So, I was able to pave out a type of business model that was based on the experience I wanted my clients to have, and being hands-on, being informed, understanding why we're selecting what we're selecting. That was really critical for me, because there are so many ways to invest, and every single person's situation is unique. Yeah,
thanks very much. Being down in beautiful Melbourne, I guess one of the parts of the uniqueness of that Melbourne market is it's very auction-centric, for example. Now, we think Sydney, eastern suburbs, everything goes to auction, but looking at the numbers, and when we've had a chat, it's predominantly auction. So there's a very different strategy that comes with going to auction versus maybe expressions of interest, or making an offer pre-auction, for example, or if that doesn't meet its reserve, and then what happens after that. So I guess you've probably got a plan of attack for all these different scenarios, for example. And love if you can just share a little bit about how do you devise a game plan and have all these kind of what-if scenarios as well when you're talking to a prospective client and buyer. How do you manage their expectations and take them on that journey as well?
It's a really good question. And when I see a property is advertised for sale, or even if I hear that a property is for sale, they're the ones that aren't listed yet. We've got to understand what sort of campaign it is before we can tackle quoted prices and strategy. If it's a private sale and it's got a price tag or a range on it and it's available to purchase right now, that's a very different proposition to a forthcoming auction or a pre-market that is still an auction campaign or an auction itself. And then you've mentioned expressions of interest. They can be a bit of a hybrid. An expression of interest might be quoted a little bit lower and the expectation is for the price to be higher. So you've got to navigate this with knowledge before you go forward with offers, and obviously doing all of your due diligence is critical too. But we have a lot of auctions in Melbourne, and purchasing prior to auction is not impossible, but sometimes it's not the right move. And if a property goes to auction and passes in and then is advertised for private sale afterwards, it will most likely be a very different price tag on the internet to what it was a few days prior when the auction day hadn't arrived. So understanding the campaign is really essential. And I find that talking to a lot of buyers from interstate or from outside of town, they won't be so familiar with our quoting regimes and with the order of events. And so we've got to take them through that before they formulate what they're prepared to pay for a property.
Yeah, nice. You touched on one word there, which is quoting regimes, for example, and we don't want to throw the word around, but look, it's been documented to me. It's been actually shown, for example, underquoting has been an issue. Now the industry's has got a plan of attack to clean that up, for example, but there are some properties where you go that even to me, I'm like, that price guide just doesn't look accurate, for example. So
yes.
How does underquoting work, for example? How do people spot it, for example? How do you address that with some of your buyers as well?
Well, understanding what underquoting means is essential. And when an agent quotes a price range for an auction, we have a regime in Victoria where we have to have what we call a statement of information attached to any documentation, and that shows 3 recent comparable sales. But comparable for one person isn't necessarily the same as for the other.
Yeah.
And our regions versus our metro quotes are different as well. In metro, it's 6 months. They've got to be within 6 months, and for regional, it's 18 months.
Wow.
So you can understand there is a lot of shades of grey here. But underquoting isn't always the fault of the agent, and it isn't always deliberate.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk about the various types of underquoting, because we've got a spotlight that's been shone on this, and there have been fines issued for deliberate underquoting. And deliberate underquoting is where an agent knows what it's worth or near to where it's worth. They know what the vendor's expectation is for the property, and they've still put a price tag on it that is insufficient to purchase the property. And the idea behind that is to bait buyers into the campaign. In the quest for a bargain, they come and have a look at the property, they fall in love with it, with the campaign, and then they're there on auction day. They might have the budget, they may stretch to buy it because they're in love with it, or they might just be numbers on the day so that the agent can say to the vendor, look, you've got 100 people in the crowd. That is deceptive underquoting, and it does happen. I'm not about to suggest it doesn't. But there are 2 other types of underquoting that aren't down to the agent misleading the public at all. The first one is if the vendor changes their mind on auction day, which can happen. They can get greedy in a hot market. They can see a house down the road that they think is comparable, sell for a record price. All of a sudden, their expectations are reset. And our legislation allows for no reserve to be set until moments before the auction. So you can imagine what kind of mess that can lead to for buyers that had done their due diligence, and also for agents that thought they knew where the vendor was at. It can really throw you a curveball when a vendor gives you a reserve that's very different to what you're expecting if you're a listing agent. And the other one, of course, is if the vendor's prepared to sell for a price that is lower than the value of the property. And you'll sometimes see mentions of something like a mortgagee auction, for instance. They might have a no reserve auction, and that will attract people just because the quest for a bargain is there present in their minds. So if a vendor is willing to sell a property that's worth $1 million for $800,000, then the agent can quote that. And we see all kinds of underquoting, but as I said, it's not always deliberately deceptive or the agent making that decision.
Yeah, thanks very much. When I'm talking to a lot of our clients that are pre-approved or heading into an auction, I say, look, there's 3 numbers. There's what the vendor wants, there's what the agent is either listing or wants as well, and that's what you're willing to pay. And they can be 3 very different numbers, and then maybe what a buyer's agent even thinks that property is worth paying for as well, which could be a 4th scenario. So I guess for your own engagement when you're talking to clients, how are you giving price guidance? Are you doing a huge amount of due diligence on recent sales? Are you saying, look, this is where the market is and we're still seeing an upward trend, and you might have to pay a slight little bit more, for example? Some clients, when they do it themselves, where I'm going with this is sometimes they get frustrated and they're like, look, I'll just throw more money at it and that'll just take the property off the market because we're sick of looking and we feel like just throwing money at this and being that aggressive buyer because we've been outbid in the past. I feel that that's the rules of the game at the moment as well. So how does that conversation work when you're talking about price guiding and the strategy as well?
I love that you've got three pins on your pin board, because I do too. Yeah. I actually call it setting an X, Y, and Z price.
Right.
I remember years ago I wrote this article about it, 3 auction prices, and I actually use that link when I'm helping my clients now. And the reality is that you're spot on. Those 3 prices, 2 of them might be aligned, all of them might be misaligned, or they could all be the same. And it's a really interesting thought. the price expectation can change through a campaign if a market's moving as well. And we've been in moving markets. We're in a slowly declining market at the moment. Last year we were in one that was running along at high pace, and that can be really difficult. But the long and short of it is, the first thing I do is establish that the vendor's not delusional and looking for a Powerball Tats Lotto price tag. Because if you've got a vendor like that, you've got to be prepared to look at other properties or hope that they come off their cloud. But all that aside, it's most important that I know what the property's market value is. And the comparable sales analysis is extensive. I'm not just looking at properties that look and feel the same. I have to look at properties that have similar zoning, orientation, similar types of encumbrances, if there are any, to make sure I'm comparing like with like. And I'll have a pretty good idea after doing that in most markets. Occasionally get that really unique property that's very, very hard to assess because there's nothing to compare it to. And that will then require a summation method where you'll look at land value per square metre, and then you'll try and work out what the cost of the dwelling is with depreciation taken into account.
Yeah,
so you can already hear it gets quite scientific.
Yeah.
And sometimes just having a chat to an opposition agent that you get along well with can help validate where your thoughts are at, because they might have been through the property to appraise it and have an opportunity to list it. And you can never forget that you've got a helping hand out there with fellow agents if you do want to run your thinking past them. But once I've worked out what I think a property is worth, and I should have a really tight range there. It shouldn't be a 10% range for me. I should be able to say to a client, market value, taking these into account, this is where I think it sits, but knowing where we are in the market cycle, where we are in our seasonal cycle. So, for example, if we're coming out of winter and stock is slow and buyers are coming out of the woodwork, which is like the market that we're in now, everybody's screaming that we don't have enough stock. So we are seeing buyers stretching for exactly the reason that you alluded to. They have found their property. They don't want to miss out on anything else. They're sick of looking. Buyer fatigue counts for a lot when it comes to stretching a budget.
Yeah.
So I've got to overlay that as well so that I understand my competition. And then I've also got to understand how much does this buyer want this and what's the cost to them if they miss it. Because if it's an infrequent type of property that only comes up twice a year and the market's moving forward, I have to prep them with that and say to them, if we miss it, that's okay. But if you're not willing to purchase anything else that isn't like this, the next one that comes along might be 5, 6, 7% later. So we have to take that into account. I don't want anyone to stretch over 5%. In fact, I don't particularly like stretching 5%, but in a fast-moving market when it's a very scarce property and the client's wish list is really tight, or if, for example, they've got time pressure, it might be pre-approval, it might be starting a new job, it might be a new baby on the way. They're all of the things that can aid a person to make the decision to stretch. But typically, I'll ask them to think about their three numbers. The first one is, where do we think it sits market value-wise? The next one is, where do we think it sits based on the market direction and seasonality? And the real price is, what's the figure that $1 more someone else can have it? So what are you prepared to let it go for? What's your absolute last bid? And I don't want them texting me that while the bidding is going. I want them to think about that and ideally tell me on Thursday or Friday morning. We want them to have a clear 24 hours of not thinking emotionally about what their maximum limit will be.
You just nailed the word there as well, which is emotion. And that is generally what's driving a lot of these decisions, because we want the property, for example, it's ticking all the boxes, and I think it's okay. We have to acknowledge that this is a highly emotional purchase. This could be the family home or the investment property. We only do this a few times in our life, and it's okay for emotions to come into it. But this is where an expert like a buyer's agent can just maybe release that pressure valve a little bit and go, okay, you can have the emotions, and I can kind of be the yin to the yang a little bit here and say, let's go through a process. And let's have this number here as well. And especially going into an auction, I've been to an auction a couple of times with clients and even ours, and like my palms are sweaty, my heart is beating. You can see the look on everyone's faces. And if you don't have that poker face, for example, you've got a trained auctioneer and a trained real estate agent that know how to maybe work that emotion into the auction as well, and it's interesting to watch it unfold sometimes.
They're very good. That's what they're trained to do.
They're paid assassins. Yeah,
absolutely. And as a bidder, we're there to keep things moving fast and to really stop our opposition bidder having a chance to think about stretching their budget.
Yeah, and
you're not allowed to actively intimidate at an auction, but you do your very best to.
Exactly right. There are mind games at play here.
Yeah.
Great. And then when we talk about buying, we're obviously talking about buying a quality asset and quite often in a quality area. So going through, say, if you're going and putting this through an investor lens, for example, people, and when I say people, a lot of our Sydney clients will to buy Interstate, maybe to bag a bargain because, comparatively purchase price on parity, it's like we're buying well below what we could pay in Sydney. So are we buying a bargain? But it's like, actually, you're buying a good quality area, which means you need to normalise that price range as well and set expectations. So for yourself, when you're talking to interstate buyers that maybe think they're buying a cheaper property, it's not. You're buying a good quality property in a good quality area. And just want to get your thoughts when you're talking to interstate buyers compared to intrastate buyers as well.
Yes, it's a good point. I think a lot of particularly Sydney-siders are surprised by our prices. We're not Mexico, I sometimes say that. We are a bit cheaper, but we're not half the price. And it can be a little bit of a shock. I've had people say, we would pay that in Sydney. Now, if you're going for an inner ring, superbly renovated period property, you need to be prepared to pay for that. And there's no doubt about it. Property prices are higher across the board in Sydney than Melbourne, but it does come as a bit of a shock. But I do talk to a lot of interstate buyers if they're looking to balance their portfolio or chase what they think is a higher capital growth market than perhaps an alternative city. And it's generally talking them through the auction regime is usually the biggest shock. Once they've got their head around our price tags, we can move forward and pivot accordingly. I mean, 700,000 in my view is probably the entry level in the Melbourne market to get a quality house on full land that has gentrification potential and won't necessarily, have significant social issues that make managing it a headache for an interstate investor. And that's really important because if you're taking on something that is in a very high crime or low socio-demographic area, it can cause a lot of issues if you're not able to be responsive to some of the things that need to be addressed as a landlord.
Yeah, well said. And going through, you just mentioned there, like budget, for example, you said, look, quality goes to circa 700. Gentrification becomes a big thing, especially, Melbourne, some of these areas, they're beautiful and they're going through rapid gentrification as well. And then what else are you actually looking for when you're going through your trained eye, when you're either shortlisting properties, they're going to make the cut, land size, dwelling quality, for example. What else kind of sits on that criteria list that your trained eye is going, that's a firm no, or that's something that we should be looking at as well?
It comes down to the strategy, actually. And if it's a capital growth strategy, I probably wouldn't be going straight into a gentrification area unless they're wanting to carry that bit of risk and get the rapid gentrification and capital growth uplift and then a steady capital growth rate. The high capital growth, blue chip, evergreen type areas aren't gentrifying, they've gentrified. And so the things that I'm looking for there are the things that people with money are happy to pay for. And they say, money grows where money goes. That's absolutely true. So if we're looking at proximity to private schools, if we're in the suburbs where we're attracting families, if we're going into suburbs where we're not attracting families, we're looking for double income, no kids, then private schools isn't a consideration for me. And areas like, Fitzroy North and Carlton, a lot of people who have visited Melbourne will be familiar with those gorgeous areas. Yeah. They're not really for school families. That's certainly not your the type of target tenant that I've necessarily got in mind. And if we're looking for things that people with money value, it's proximity to work, it's lifestyle around them, shops, stations, beautiful houses surrounding. They want something that they're really proud of. They want to be very connected with the city as well. If we're going for a high rental return, then I'm looking for things that will bolster up the rental, and that will be more bedrooms, ensuite, more bells and whistles internally, probably a renovated or a newer property. I don't buy brand new, but if rental return is the mandate, then I've got to make sure that I capture that. But if it's gentrification, that's very, very different. You're looking for signs of an area becoming an up-and-coming area
Yeah.
or catching on with some surrounding areas. And that's not easy for everyone to do. That is a science, and it's taken me a long time, a lot of study to be able to look at the right indicators in our ABS data and the rate of change of some of these things in tandem to pick an area that I'm confident will have an outperformance uplift in the coming years.
Yeah.
And people aren't all that patient when they're looking for something that's gentrifying. They won't be happy about giving it 10 years. They want something that will go bang in the next few years.
Correct.
And so that really takes a lot of art and science.
And you're saying, I mean, the science is data, the art is being able to be kind of in the neighbourhood and boots on the ground going, I can actually see what's going on from a grassroots level, and you wouldn't know that if you just dug your head in the sand. From a data perspective, these numbers have to make sense. You actually have to see it happening and almost have some probably connections as well to go, there's some infrastructure, there's some changes or some cool shops coming through here, for example, that are going to start that trend as well to make that an attraction suburb as well.
I think the art is actually getting the client across the line, because the hardest thing about a gentrifying suburb, picking it before it's gone bang, is it looks like an ugly duckling. So everyone says, get me a gentrifying suburb, but not that one. Well, that one is the one. And that's a very difficult thing to talk to someone about, because they're putting significant money on the line and trusting you.
Correct.
And once the cool shops are there, it's already gentrified. So we've got to look at leading indicators in demographic data, and that's much, much harder.
Yeah, well said. Well said. There's an article that you've published recently, which I loved, and we call it "The Cost of Fear." And there's a great saying, escapes me who said it. I have a lot of fears in my life, but most of them have never happened. And I feel like that's the journey for a lot of investors, where it's either like the market's changing, rates are going to go up, for example, value's going to go down, renters are going to destroy my property. And I've spoken openly about fear setting. So list all your fears, for example, and what's the likelihood they're going to happen. And so I guess part of an investor's fear journey is the value goes down, tenants either destroy or don't pay rent, for example, our greatest asset. There's a couple more that will come into it, but take me through your own journey and how you documented some of those fears and listening to people and people that maybe have the right intention or are watching out for you or have your back, but can also get into your head a little bit and steer you on a different course as well.
That's right. The ones that love us aren't necessarily our best people to turn to for property advice. And I experienced that. I was very young when I got into property, and I had a burning desire to buy something. And my dear dad was worried that I would take on more debt than I should have as a young, not even graduate. I was working a night job, and I'd saved a lot of money in the Coles Deli, and I had good hours. And I was in a position to buy something with a really good LVR as well. And if I was more confident and knew more about what I was doing, I would have probably not consulted and just told him after the event. But that wasn't how it went. And at the time, the property purchase price would have been $132,000. And you and I both know what time does to a figure like that. But at the time, my dad was worried about it, so I let him talk me out of it. And after that, I had regret that I'd let someone rattle my strategy. And I decided to then do something. I ended up purchasing at a slightly higher price tag than that, and I had the confidence to do so. But I didn't buy as good a property as that very first one. I actually bought an off-the-plan townhouse because the idea of new and glossy sounded really good. And lucky for me, the area took off, and by the time the build was almost complete, the builder offered me to buy it back for a higher price. So I already knew I was on a winner with that one. But I made a mistake by feeling the need to sell that to upgrade and to buy a better capital growth asset, when in actual fact, if I had talked to a good quality mortgage broker, I would have been able to use the equity and keep the original one as well. But I purchased a property when interest rates were high and climbing. I was young. I was on a graduate chemist salary, which wasn't great. And I backed myself. And you have, if you've got discretionary income that you can count and see and feel, then you can wind back your living expenses. You can live a bit more frugally when you have to.
Correct.
And at the time, I didn't think anything of it. I'd come from a household where I absolutely remember when interest rates hit 18%. And it was tough. I had parents with multiple jobs and, you could feel that things were pretty tense financially during that time. So the idea of 7, 8, 9% per annum didn't frighten me at all. It was what I expected. I didn't have anything else really to contrast it to.
Yeah.
So was I fearful? No, I was conscious that I was carrying risk. There's no doubt about it. But I had people around me telling me not to do what I was doing, and I wanted to purchase more properties. And my theory then was, go hard or go home.
Nice.
I was in my 20s though.
And at that stage, are you blissfully unaware? Because I feel like for a lot of our investors, for example, when they're young, when we're young, you don't necessarily have the means. So you have a limited deposit and you've got very limited borrowing capacity, especially the incomes that we're on in our 20s. And then as you start to mature and go on in life, your income goes up, your properties have got equity, and the tide starts to turn a little bit, which is now it's like, I've got this, I don't want to risk losing it, as opposed to gain more. And there's this real inflection point that I see for a lot of investors going, I've got to this point, I don't want to make a bad decision, it's going to set me back. So maybe they sit on their hands a little bit more as well. And it's very interesting to watch that dynamic. And I can almost feel it sometimes in my own self going, bad decision may set me back. And I'd prefer not to make a decision than make a bad decision, perhaps as well.
Yeah, this is probably giving you more information than you thought about my risk profile. I only had that inflection point a couple of years ago, and I'm nearly 48, so I've been doing this for more of my life than not doing it. But no, I didn't. I certainly was aware of the risk, but I always think about plan B, and I am an optimistic girl by any measure. But I always thought to myself, what's the worst case scenario? Worst case scenario is I pop a tenant in there and I house share with someone. And the more properties you have, the more options you've got to find more tenants. I wasn't about to fall apart about that. I never imagined what it would feel like when the GFC hit. And that was such a moment for me, because I'd kind of blissfully lived through any other downturns because I was too young to really be impacted.
Yeah.
But the GFC hit and I was a mortgage broker, and we had lenders dropping out of the Australian market with no notice. It was horrifying, and all of our maximum LVRs and lending requirements changed within a space of days. It was happening very quickly, broker alerts every hour, and I knew that things were going on. And the news out of the US was really awful.
Yeah.
And my manager at the time was telling us that things would get really ugly. And then we started seeing fire sales and people making decisions that reflected their understanding of the market, but also where they thought the market would head. And I met a guy in a coffee shop who was trying to sell his own property. Crazy to think back on it now, but, selling his own property for a price tag that sounded really attractive. I knew the area. And so I asked him if I could have a look at it. And I purchased a property on Christmas Eve in 2008, which was when the House of Cards was really tumbling.
Correct. That was the peak. I can very clearly remember the day, actually, that day.
Yeah, it was horrible. So we walked down to the conveyancer's office, and if I'd told any of my friends or family or colleagues that I was buying a house, then they would have thought I was insane. So I didn't. My husband and I made the decision to just do it. We had a 20-day settlement. I was the mortgage broker, so I had confidence that I could pull the docs together in time. And it was a bargain by any measure. And in fact, it was probably my sharpest buy. But I bought when everyone was fearful.
I love that. And I love that sentiment, because that's what you're projecting to your own clients. And we'll see this sometimes, whether it's the buyer's agency space, mortgage broking space, is we're projecting fears onto clients. I'm like, look, this is what you can do. Do your due diligence, help you make a confident decision as well. But quite often people then projecting their own fears, going, well, rates are going to get high, for example, you won't be able to afford it. I'm like, look, that's up to the client generally to then make those lifestyle decisions about whether they can or can't afford this and whether they do want to buy it. But projecting your fears onto someone else then becomes a real thing where they're getting muddled down, they're hearing conflicting information as well, isn't it?
Very much so. I think giving everyone an accurate idea of what the options are,
Correct.
What the scenario is. I'm always happy to say to people, I'll tell you what I think, but this is your decision. And let's talk through the worst case scenario, the best case scenario, the likely scenario. Let's talk about your mitigants and your buffers. And that's really important. I'll never sugarcoat something. I need people to know when they're making an educated risk.
Yeah, love it. I love it. And that, to me, I'm like, that sums up your role, which is making educated decisions, having their back, and then guiding through one of the most important financial decisions they're going to make.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lovely, Cate. I'm very confident we're going to get you back on at some point in the future. Learn about your journey and where the market's going to shift and change too as well. I feel like it's going to continue to shift and evolve this market. And it's the big word that I'm using with a lot of our clients and our team is adaptability. How can we adapt to the change as well? Because that's the constant. The change is going to be constant. How do we adapt, evolve, and move with this market that's going to shape how the future unfolds as well? So, Cate Bakos, thank you very much for joining us. Like I said, you've got so much wisdom that you sit on. Cate often produces videos that are high caliber information. I know the blog that comes out as well, and so many media releases that you are featured in heavily in the media contain nuggets of gold as well. So I want to say thank you very much for being on here and enlightening us as well.
Oh, you're very kind, but thank you. It's been a blast.
Appreciate it. If you do want to reach out to Cate and her team, we'll include details to their website, social, so you can connect with them and maybe find out how they can help you on your journey as well. And that's a wrap for another episode of the Australian Property Investment Podcast. If you found that helpful, please leave us a review or give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more episodes to drop shortly. I've been your host, Aaron Christie David. Thank you very much.